Hey, fiends of the pod, this is your host, Nate Wyckoff, and I want to remind you, go ahead and like and subscribe and check out cultandclassicfilms.com, where you can get cult movies exclusive to us with all sorts of extras like pogs. We're supposed to call them milk caps. They're not pogs. I don't know what pogs are. Autographed posters, slipcovers, all sorts of neat things. You can also subscribe to have them delivered to your door every month at a discount. That is cultandclassicfilms.com. Remember, like, subscribe, comment, and refer to your friends, even your enemies. Every time you like and subscribe, we make sure Michael Cera makes another film. Yeah, that's right. It's us. Enjoy.
Welcome to Cult and Classic.
Welcome, friends and fiends, to another episode of Cult and Classic Films podcast. I'm your host, film critic and comedian Nate Wyckoff, and with me today we have longtime contributor Mandy Longley. How are you doing, Mandy?
I am here, but I am invisible.
That's right. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, Mandy's camera is up, but she is not on it. So we will just pretend that she is speaking to us disembodied somewhere in the ether. So this has been a delayed episode. I've constantly had things popping up between funerals and technical things with the company. So everything's great, and we are back on track. And we are going to talk about part 2 of our double feature that we call Sex Education with Emily Stone. Of course, we're talking about Emma Stone, who recently noted that she preferred to be referred to as Emily Stone. So we're going to talk to her, or about her rather. I wish we could talk to her. Emily, give us a call, as Emily Stone. So last week, or rather last entry into this pairing, we talked about Easy A, the teen teen comedy. The brain is still melted, but we're here. The teen comedy about sort of it's interesting because that movie sort of used as an inspiration the Scarlet Letter, Nathaniel Hawthorne's famous, I believe it's a novella, but it could be a full novel. I think it's a novella though. And this movie, Poor Things, which we're talking about today from 2023, late 2023, which is currently streaming on Hulu, is heavily inspired and paralleled and, as we'll talk about, subverted from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So we have two movies here that are heavily inspired by literature, which is another interesting parallel between these movies, although, of course, they are quite different. So this is a pairing, both these movies, that Mandy herself recommended, and I'm glad she did. This is a great pairing. We loved Easy A. Go listen to our episode on it if you haven't. And then this movie is wild. This movie was one of those that kind of came out of nowhere, and it took critics by storm and surprisingly got fairly wide theatrical release, although I don't know what the actual numbers were. While it swept a lot of awards categories and such, it is a strange movie. It is not in the mainstream vein. So let's talk about it. All right, first things first, it is star-studded. It has Emily Stone, Mark Ruffalo, Willem Dafoe. That's just to name some of the mains. And then we have so many other great cast members in there. And I'm trying to think if I do have a list here. We've got Margaret Qualley, Tom Storton. We have who else is in here that would be easily recognizable to many? Well, of course, Rami Youssef, Vicky Pepperdine, who is, if you start looking at her resume, you'll realize, oh, I know her from all sorts of people. So there's just really a pretty impressive cast of characters, and it's a large cast, even though most people, it's a very episodic film. So most people only appear for a section of the movie. In fact, the movie is separated into sort of chapters that are a title screen literally pops up with a black and white image of sort of a surrealistic something, landscape, floating, stone, whatever, with the lead character Bella, played by Emily Stone, on it. The plot is that Willem Dafoe is a sort of mangled scientist that sort of looks like what we imagine Frankenstein to look like, covered in stitches and such things. He is actually a scientist. He was mangled by his father, who was torturous to him, although he seems to not speak of it that way. He speaks of him with a weird sort of reverence. And he this is not a spoiler. It is revealed fairly early in the movie, and perhaps one of the strangest aspects of the movie that you have to just accept and go on is that there's a character named Victoria who jumps off a bridge, and she is taken out of the water and given to Willem Dafoe's character, who is a scientist and a surgeon. At which point he is like, the body's alive and the body is pregnant, and so he takes the baby's brain and puts it in the full adult mother's body. Totally bonkers banana sandwich. But what it means is we have the stand-in Frankenstein creation of the character Bella, played by Emma Stone, who grows up throughout the movie. She starts as essentially a toddler in a full-grown woman's body, and progresses as her mind sort of gets closer to meeting the age of her physical body. The movie is, as I said, it's a subversion of the Frankenstein idea, but it's also it's very allegorical, and it has a lot to do. I've seen some people calling it a feminist film. I would hazard to say I'm not sure it's a feminist film so much as it's a critique of male behavior film. It is, which of course means that women bear a huge brunt of the really shitty things that men do, and how kind of awful as a gender we tend to be in our species. But it is not necessarily, the focus is not so much to me on the strength and rise of women, although certainly Bella does have this progression to to sort of owning her own life. But she also, and we'll talk about it, I don't think she really starts out in a recognizing that she's in some sort of oppressed position. In fact, she starts out from moment one with the sort of predisposed self-interest of a toddler, and is for the most part able to express it so freely that it's like you would, if she was an actual child, you would have been that person in the restaurant going, why doesn't that person do something? Tell her to sit down, tell her to stop being crazy. But she doesn't. And so to me, that's sort of the hinge of the argument, that I don't think it's necessarily, at least not primarily, a feminist film, but rather a film that is specifically illustrating and critiquing men's behavior towards women. So I do think those can be two different things. It certainly applies to feminist theory, but it's not necessarily what I would consider a feminist film. Okay. And it's also directed and written by men, based off of a novel by Alistair Gray, who passed away, I believe, in 2019, and did a whole bunch of writing that came to the large and small screen. So it actually has kind of a happy ending in many ways. There are, as I said, tons of characters, and it is a journey film, right? She's going, it's following her instead of the scientist. It's following the monster, so to speak, in the Frankenstein tale. And there's a lot of differences that make this a completely subverted version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So, Mandy, you saw this in theaters. I was foolish and missed it in theaters. What was your initial impression? Well, I guess your impression during the film and when you finished the film the first time.
First I was like, oh wow, am I glad I came to this alone? Because I can't imagine dragging any of my friends to see this and like being comfortable knowing that I drag them to see this, because it is definitely an opt-in kind of movie. Like like
Yes.
perhaps not a good one to go into blind, or just going into being like, oh, I'm a fan of some of these actors. Like, let's see what they're up to in this project. Because there is a lot of like uncomfortable material in this. I know that there are some people that I've talked to who, I think possibly the book, but definitely the movie, they're really icked out by kind of the it wasn't really like a theme or totally presented as like pedophilia, but like the male gaze for like very young acting women who perhaps have a mature body.
Yeah.
And, and just being like, oh, like she seems old enough, like, yeah, like I'm into it. I'm gonna take advantage of her. Um, Not necessarily meaning rape, but like, uh, like getting
It's
her
taking
into
advantage of
kind of getting
someone.
her in over her head in situations that she doesn't have experience with. Yeah, and taking advantage of her like innocence and developmental phase that she is in at that
Mhm.
time. And like, yeah, I knew a bunch of people got really icked out like from like a pedophilia perspective on that
And this
with
is
like,
an uncomfortable film. Like it's
yeah,
it's
it's very
crazy.
uncomfortable.
This is because it's very difficult to actually classify. On the surface, it looks like a horror film, an art house film.
Hmm.
In description, when you go to like IMDb or Hulu or whatever, it puts it as comedy, drama, romance, which is pretty much wrong on all fronts to me. Um,
Yeah.
Maybe drama, but it's not realistic enough to be drama.
Hmm.
And it's while it has some absurd moments that have a comedic element, even a tone to them, it's not
Yeah.
comfortable enough to be funny. And
It,
while
yeah.
there's lots of sex and talk of marriage in it, it is in no way romantic. So
No.
it's just one of those things where you're
Yeah.
like, what would you call this? I guess I
Like
personally, I don't
yeah,
know.
what would you call it? I
Well,
would call it sci-fi social commentary, but I don't think that's a genre.
yeah, I do think if you had to pick just one, sci-fi would be the one, because sci-fi is perhaps the most broad, I think, of all genre descriptions, right? You have everything from
Mm.
Star Wars to Solaris, to like these
Yeah.
really understated contemporary, like modern world takes on science fiction to something completely fantastical in another world. That said, it's horror to me in the fact that it is it- the the much of the content is horrible, but it is not because of Emily Stone's character's behavior and the way she approaches situations. It's not. It doesn't feel like a horror movie. It's not traditionally a horror movie. There's a few scenes of not many, but early on, because the scientist is a surgeon, there's some gruesome moments. Um, but really it's just the discomfort that comes with this movie. And I think too, a lot of people were like, "Oh, Emily Stone is doing a lot of like really risque sex scenes and nudity." And while those are there, they went out of their way to kind of make her appear what we now I think would consider straight up ugly, like really weird looking. Because I don't think in any way Emily Stone is not attractive, but they gave her these like profoundly thick, solid black eyebrows that are set very low over her eyes, and this lank, unnaturally black hair. It's very unsettling in many ways. Like she's desired by men throughout the movie, and people become, as they say, mesmerized by her, and she's a beauty. But that's clearly in this world because by our standards, she's not put together in a beautiful way, right? Everybody on in cinema right now, if they're beautiful, essentially doesn't matter of their ethnicity or origins. They're basically have Kardashian makeup like plastered over their face, right? Like that's the standard look at the moment. And they do not choose to do that with Bella. Uh, the makeup,
Yeah, and I
yeah.
mean, like, yeah. So, like, I like what you said earlier about how it's like basically more of like a critique on how men treat women, and the different chapters that she goes through are like
Mhm.
different interactions she's having with a different kind of main type of male.
Mhm.
I don't want to say stereotype, but like
Archetype.
archetype situation.
Mhm.
And it is interesting that like her creator and his assistant, like they are trying, I guess they're doing this experiment. They're trying to create and find out what a woman would be if she was not told by society what she is
Mhm.
supposed to be. Right. So they're
Yeah.
like, what what will she be? Not like what she's capable of, or
Mhm.
like um even like her likes or dislikes, or like, will she just be like a man if we don't tell her to be like a woman? Like, uh, and I think that that might be like that attractiveness or like mesmerizing feature that the rest of the characters come up against. Like, right? It's like why
Mhm.
Mark um
Ruffalo.
Ruffalo, his character is so obsessed with her, and
Mhm.
it like breaks his mind because she is just kind of truly herself
She's
without.
kind of like him, right? She's what
Yeah,
he's the like the user cad who is just the out for fun, like, oh, this pretty young woman, I'm gonna steal her away in the night by climbing on her on the roof and seducing her and like touching her like when nobody else is around. And yet, and so he has the
but like
power, he thinks, uh, but he
except that
doesn't.
she like specifically says to her creator, like, yeah, this is gonna fuck me up, but I'm gonna go and do it, like,
Yeah, she's
you
incredibly
know.
self-aware of the literal implication of her every situation.
Yeah,
Um, and she sort of doesn't have, well, in a way, it's like, oh, look how much like a man she can act when she doesn't impose on herself what society imposes on women, right? She says when something's disgusting and she doesn't like it and she spits it on her plate, when people are supposed to be um high society and oh, this is much, and like she'll say these really outrageously uh inappropriate things as far as what we're consider, and yet is like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't is that also incorrect to do? And she just doesn't, as you said, she doesn't have the boundaries that we have in society, and she does sort of come to some of them as the film moves on, but its its effect on masculinity as presented in this movie is fascinating, because Mark Ruffalo's character is the one she spends the most time with, because she, like you said, she runs away with him and is like, "Father, don't stop me, because I've been trapped here, and now I'm going to experience the world." Frankly, because now she's been betrothed, not it's sort of like she's been betrothed to the assistant, the student character played by Yama Yusuf, who seems to be a very nice man, but as you alluded to before, they're taking advantage of her because she is a child at this point, essentially in mind, and she only knows two men. The one that she considers her father, who makes her call him God, which is insane, but also very telling, and this guy. And he's enchanted by her, which is innately predatory, because whether or not she thinks that she's consensual, she is her world is so narrowed by the people in her life that it's a sort of the manufacturing of consent, to mention the Noam Chomsky book. I unfortunately forget his co-author, right? It's like you think that you're doing what you want, but that's because the forces around you have made it seem like there's only these two options. So picking one is your choice, but really you're confined to two options arbitrarily. So in itself, you cannot give consent in that environment, right? So it's wrong. Even if you can't put that into like words when you're watching the movie, you know that it's wrong, and weird, beyond the fact that she's got the mentality of a child. So she goes with this guy because she's like, look, I can't marry you. I haven't had sex. I haven't had any experience, which is fascinating, right? Because she's like, I can't get married, not because I don't want to, but because why in the world would I go into this without knowing anything? And why would you want me to? Um, and so she goes on this thing, and most of the time she's spent exploring these different locations and having lots of sex with Mark Ruffalo's character, who, for his part as an actor, tried to talk his way out of the role. He thought he was too old, etc. But actually, I can't see the role going to anybody else. Um,
yeah, he was fantastic.
he because
And
he's
him and his little like um corset, his little man corset
yes,
for
and
his
his little and
filming was
his like
hilarious.
salt and pepper push broom mustache.
Yes,
He's just, and he's not a big man, right? Like, not that
yeah,
Emily Stone is either, but it's, or a big woman. It's just his character was perfect because he's able to go from like the slimy debonair cad to like the the almost threatening um figure, but then able to collapse into like the frankly ineffectual, tragically deficient, putz. And it's very interesting, and he does a very good job of this. And it's, he starts out by like, oh, I'm taking this girl for a ride, I'm gonna do whatever I want, and then she's gonna move, and then then this will end, and I'll move on with my life being a cad. But of course, because of her disinterest, right, her sort of cold um viewing of the relationship as simply something for fun that will not be permanent, right? Because as far as she's concerned, she's still betrothed to the assistant. um he
Yeah, she's
realizes,
like, I'll be back a little bit more broken, but I'll be back.
right,
Like,
and it's like, which certainly in her experience could probably make sense, right? Her God, Willem Dafoe's character, is physically broken in profound ways. um it's just very fascinating because we see the most obvious effect of the masculine, the predisposed ideal of the masculine in Mark Ruffalo's character. And because Bella does not play along with it, because she does not acquiesce to see it as it's presented, right? She doesn't give into the power. She's like, I'm not going to do that because of this potential masculine threat. um, that actual masculine falsehood completely falls apart. And he becomes so completely devastated that his entire persona, his entire schema of operation is completely ineffectual on her. And that breaks him to the point where he's in an asylum. And it's interesting because the way it's played, he's not crazy, but it's almost as though he's saying he's crazy and thus acting in a way he thinks crazy would be, to the point where he's in an insane asylum because he refuses to accept that his draw is not so complete as to control Bella, right? Because the implication is he doesn't actually want Bella, necessarily. Like, honestly, his desire for her is because she has made him realize that he is not uh, ineffably desirable, right? It's that whole idea of like, tons of TV shows and sitcoms have this plot moment where it's like, well, you wanted to break up with them, but when they break up with you, you're like, wait a minute, why? I can change, like you don't want to be the one on the short end of the stick. Um, and so he literally, it's like his machismo is so deeply ingrained that the only way he can see out of being essentially emasculated, as far as he's concerned, is to be, I'm now crazy because of this. Like, it's easier for me to play my life as being crazy than it is to accept that I've become smitten with someone who feels the way I expected to feel about her. And it's that alone is a strong lesson. um, as you're kind of, if you haven't seen this movie, if you're out there, and I know you're out there, you probably are getting the impression that this is a very literary film. And by that, I mean, we've talked about these before, like at midnight, not at midnight, Heart of Midnight and Nightcrawler. These films where I think they take and also promote a huge amount uh, of literary theory application and deep thinking, right? Because and anybody reading the reviews online of this movie are deeply saddening to me. Not because people don't like it, but because of how surface people are used to viewing films. Like this just one of the more popular, and I'm not trying to offend anyone, but I think it's telling. One of the more popular rated reviews on IMDb is what was it? This is the description of the story from them. It's kind of 3 out of 5. It's kind of a bland story, self-exploration made in a yucky way if you think about the actual implications. I'm like, that is the most, you could have read like a paragraph description of the film and come away with that. But to me, I don't understand how you could watch the events on film and not see a complete, like, there's so much more to it than that. That description discounts the nuances of every single character's performance. For example, in Frankenstein, one of the most talked about and accepted literary critiques or analysis, I should say, of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is that it reverses, in itself subverts the stereotypical male-female dynamic, because Dr. Frankenstein is a man, gives birth essentially to his monster, but he has no matriarchal child raising care, no
There's no
innate
maternal instinct.
maternal instinct. Correct. He has no maternal instinct. So he rejects the monster, and he does tons of things that are associated with only women at that time. And even now, he faints constantly, right? He has all of these feminine aspects, and he fails at the thing that women at that time, and still unfortunately here, are expected to do most, which is raise a child. So it's like it points out these deficiencies in men and these strengths in women that are not acknowledged by reversing this, and by reversing the stance. This man is taking on a woman's role and utterly failing at it. And so that's a reading of Frankenstein. And given the fact that Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, was a very active, strong feminist who wrote about sort of gender dichotomy, that makes absolute sense. I think that to not accept, at least in some level, that reading of Frankenstein is just willful ignorance, if you know anything about the author and etc. So, but when you look at this movie, Frankenstein then is already a subversive story as far as gender roles go. But you'd think, at least I thought, that by subverting further the idea of Frankenstein and making the monster a woman, you would sort of almost put back the pieces to where it becomes almost the standard status quo again. Like it would almost prove the opposite of what Mary Shelley kind of intended, but it doesn't. It actually pushes it even more banana sandwich into an allegorical discussion, exploration of men in our society, right? So the woman who is the monster is not rejected, right? In fact, if anything, she's given full control and has almost no boundaries. In fact, when the scientist, Willem Dafoe's character, yells at her to stop or tells her not to do something, she responds with violence, with essentially a full-grown woman doing a temper tantrum. And ultimately, she gets what she wants most of the time.
Yeah.
And so she has no boundaries, right? But she is raised by someone that she essentially loves as a father. And because of that, she enters the world with, she enters the world more successfully than Frankenstein's monster, but she also is not prepared for the world, which is the same thing that Frankenstein's monster engaged with. He had to learn by watching a family through a hole in their wall. And so he cannot engage because he doesn't know. And when he does learn, he learns that visually he's monstrous to people. And so he can't even make the first step to connect with people. Emily Stone's character, Bella, is different because she does have a home. She's still not prepared, but her appearance allows her strength in the society. She's able to leverage the appearance before she even understands that she's doing that and that she can do that to be in society. So in that respect, it says, well, society also, I think you can push to men. Men value the appearance, right? And then you're like, okay, they value the appearance. So what's next for this change in Frankenstein's story? Well, the monster in Frankenstein is shown to have compassion at some level. Like the trail to his ultimate murder and destruction is, or essentially murder and suicide, is he has been rejected by society and sees no alternative. He cannot enter society. Emily Stone's character finds success and easily enters society. And it's not until she develops a sense of compassion and empathy that she sees how tragic the world is in many ways and how not everyone has the ability and the things she has. And that presses her to then reevaluate how she acts in society. It's no longer fun to be destructive. So it's it's sort of fan fiction in a way of how Frankenstein would be had he had a very lenient creator. Um, Also, and I wonder what you think about this. I was thinking that it's almost as if Willem Dafoe's character, being visually Frankenstein as he is, it's almost as if Frankenstein's monster creates the monster, right? And in that respect, we get, which I do think is sort of true. I think about this in the world all the time as one generation dies out and then the next several generations move into power. We're seeing this with Gen Z. Most obviously, millennials like us are just plain struggling. But as the boomer generation approaches older age and ultimately dies, we see this, what looks like progress to us, and I think it is, socially at least, right,
Mm.
to the next generation. Things continue to change, hopefully improve. Anybody that says the world is worse now than it's ever been has never read a history book at all. I'm not saying it's not terrible and tragic in so many ways. But in that, we're seeing a generational change similar then, right? If Frankenstein, the monster, is actually Willem Dafoe, and he's bringing the next generation in, which is Emma Stone, or Emily Stone's character, Bella, then
Yeah.
she is becoming more kind and more of an intentional positive influence by the end of the movie. And it's only going to improve, right? It's going to continue this upward trend. That's one way to look at it as well. Sorry, I have totally monopolized this. So what do you think about the progression of Bella from childhood through to her ultimate fully realized self at the end of the movie?
I I liked the phases that she went through. Um Somewhat mirroring, like, average or like expected development of, like,
Mm-hmm.
toddler, adolescent, teen, and then like mature um adults that, has some wisdom
Mm-hmm.
and also kind of some running out of fucks to give about things
Right.
anymore, like thinking about her standoff with her like predecessor version, like her previous
Yeah.
husband.
Her original body,
um
her mother essentially's husband,
yeah,
Alfie, who is a
right,
violent militaristic soldier who sees her as territory to conquer.
right, and she's just like, bring it, like, I have zero fucks to give
Yeah,
about
he
any of
he
this,
threatens
right?
her with a gun because she's like, I will
Yeah,
leave when I want, and I haven't done you
yeah,
any wrong because she has become at one point a prostitute. She has done all
yeah,
these things. She's like, and I've done you no wrong because I don't even know you.
right,
And so and then he threatens her, and her response, like clearly, Emily Stone is good at she has big eyes, she has a very expressive face. She's very good at conveying multiple emotions and impressions from just a silent look. So I feel like in that moment, as well as several others, she is what you could call nervous or afraid, but it's
hmm,
more she's calculating on the back end
yeah,
how to play this out versus frozen or putting that concern outward. And so
right,
he's like, well, then I'll have to shoot you, and I'll shoot you in the head. And she just says, the front of the head or the back of the head, and
yeah,
like matter of factly, and he answers her, right? And it's just, but that's her whole approach to everything, is an acceptance of the situation and then a decision on how to move forward.
yeah,
um, and that's a very scientific approach, right? Which brings it back to essentially her de facto father, the Willem Dafoe, whose father was so abusive to him in an utterly cruel way that it's very clear early on from his description of, for example, his father retarding the growth of his thumbs by putting them in like clamps until they essentially contort. and I think even break. And he's like, it was an experiment. And basically, he's like, when I looked at it, or when my father came in and saw the blood, I was smiling at it. And it's sort of like he's created this construct of viewing everything as an experiment in order to be able to continue his life without falling into complete and utter um, depressed destruction.
Yeah.
And Bella sort of does the same thing then ultimately, because she sees these situations that are not tenable if you look at them from a moral standpoint, and says, okay, it's an experiment. How do we move forward? How will this progress? What
Mhm.
can be learned from this experience? And it's I think it's clear that it's something she has learned from her previous generation, through observance versus actually being taught. And that, because it's not being taught and it's observance, it does not develop or show until she's faced with injustices or limitations in the real world, right? That we face as adults. That character of Alfie comes in only very briefly at the end, and uh, he of course gets his comeuppance. This is one of those movies where I was fairly certain halfway through that I'm like, this will end in a great tragedy. And then as the film continues on, you're like, maybe not, because I can't see what the ultimate impact will be of that. If, say, Bella, because in the beginning, the first scene we see in the movie is Bella's previous incarnation, right? The mother pregnant with child, killing herself by jumping off of a bridge. That's the first scene we see. And so my brain, as a critic and filmmaker, was thinking, well, this interesting full circle will be this essential child in an adult body having no restrictions and completely finding all the things they want to do in life and doing whatever they want and enjoying it. All of a sudden, eventually coming to an abrupt realization, being forced to see all of the terror in the world and the fact that we have limitations because the society that we have constructed and has been constructed by others around us is this cage, and ultimately commit suicide herself in this sort of cyclical, like, look, I learned what my mother learned, and now I'm making the same decision. That was my thought going into it.
Mhm.
And I think you could do that, but it would be a very different, it would feel very different, right? That's a very nihilistic view. This movie ends with Bella essentially coming out on top, but not, this is what I love. It's not what I would expect. It's not a John Wick film, and not dissing John Wick. I love Keanu Reeves. Um, but instead of revenge being gotten and the end, and that's the end, like, oh, the story is done. I've revenged whatever I wanted to revenge. Whoever is the bad one has gotten their comeuppance. It ends with Bella having brought all of the people in her life that she cares about to her, and they're literally having like a picnic in the yard, and she's doing what she wants, which is reading, which is sort of was the first catalyst for her to enter society as a contributing member in some way. She has her friend prostitute and lover beside her, and she has her her first betrothed, the assistant Max, as sort of the family dog in a way, not unhappily so. Um, and then the servant who is always frustrated taking care of her, right? Because it's not a child; she's a full-grown adult taking care of this, this toddler in a full-grown body running around breaking things, hurting things, whatever. She's happy, and she is actually playing happily with what is a very disturbing part of the movie, Bella's successor, this new sort of infantile woman that the scientist and assistant made when Bella was gone because they missed her, right? How sick is that? Like, she gets to see and acknowledge that when faced with nothing, when faced with the loss of the female component that they've controlled and theoretically love, right? But their expression of it is quite concerning. When they lose her, they cannot operate without her, so they replace her. And of course, it doesn't work, right? They don't feel any sort of closeness, not that they don't feel the closeness that they did, because she's not the same person, even as a child. And it's crazy because you're like, wow, men are so incapable, because Bella is not incapable of being alone. She freely says, okay, I'm done, and leaves different people. She is operating on her own while the men around her cannot function on their own. They truly collapse and like scramble for whatever sense of self they can get from another person. And it's a woman always, right? So, for example, Mark Ruffalo, he breaks down because he can't have her and he can't be alone. So he needs her because his sense of self and his masculinity, which has been his whole deal, is broken. And so he can't find someone else because he feels like there's no option for him because he is emasculated. And that was what got him what he wanted. And so because of that, he only has the option, he thinks, of going back to Bella. So it's another reveal of the fragility of the masculine identity in our society, because women are so necessary to these men that they cannot they can't function without them. And this is one of those times when we're going to pause for a moment because your host's computer is not plugged in.
Oh no.
And we are back. Hopefully that was but a second of your time as I ran at the speed of middle age to get the charger. So as listeners, as you can tell, if you're a new listener, which welcome to the Cult and Classic Films Fiend family, I tend to completely bulldoze my contributors and use them as walls, which I spit my ideas out at, and then in the podcast episode. But I would like to hear, Mandy, when you think about the purpose of the film, oftentimes, like a popcorn movie, it's very clear, right? We're entertained. I feel like it's very often for me, it's escapism. I am experiencing something else so I can sort of not think or worry about anything in my actual life. This film, for me, as probably obvious by my commentary on it, made me think the whole time. It was an escapism of a different sense. It's an escapism because my mind is working. It cannot escape because it is not just focusing on something, it is constantly thinking about it and trying to make sense of it. And to me, that happens when I ask myself, it has happened when I ask myself, what's the purpose of this movie? Because if it's not quick to come to my mind, the movie has depth, because it means to me that it requires more thought. There are the rare cases when truly I think it means that there is no purpose. That said, I think if you think deep enough, everything has some sort of hidden meaning, whether that's good or bad. So Mandy, what do you think? When you left this theater, did you have an idea of what you felt the movie's purpose was? Why was it shown to us?
I think that its purpose was just to challenge the
Mm,
audience, to number one, to think, to perhaps see maybe both their good and less desirable attributes displayed in each of these caricatures of society, both maybe male and female. Um, like maybe perhaps be like, can you, as hard as it is as a male, identify with some of the things that they are showing in these male characters? Um, maybe there are other ones where like you support, like, oh, challenge you to be like, can you be supportive of a woman developing or healing without the requirements of society? Like,
mhm,
can you help or support a woman to be more her true self? And although they presented in a pretty outlandish environment, like what might you need to do? Like what kind of space might you need to hold or create for someone to
mhm,
have that kind of freedom? Like, could you do it? Right? Like, what are the things that you give up for yourself by doing it? In the view of society, right?
mhm.
Because it makes you an outsider as well. Um, this is like, I think that was like a challenge. one thing that you had not mentioned, we're mentioning mostly just like the plot
Hmm.
and like the themes, but there
Yeah.
is also a lot that was challenging about this from a visual and auditory
Yes.
perspective as well.
Yes, you're right.
Um, the you mentioned it's done in chapters. These chapters are not just chapters in the story; they are chapters in her development and outlook
Hmm.
on her life, and how she is moving through it from a less developed mind to a more developed and
And they're
sophisticated
named
mind.
after locations, suggesting, as you said,
Right.
her movement.
Her movement, but also the cinematography or like the cinematic style, the style of this photography, as well as the colors and the soundtrack, um, also develop in each
Yeah.
of those chapters.
The
Like we
sound becomes
start
more melodic.
right,
Um,
we start out in black and white with like random weird noises that don't have any melody to them, are quite dissident, as one might kind of feel like a toddler is
mhm,
maybe like maybe not experiencing the world necessarily, but like imparting on the world, like
mhm,
their kind of chaos and disjointed uh interactions. And then we move on to like ridiculously like saturated color
mhm.
and brightness and almost like
Almost
a
Willy
future
Wonka.
almost what I was gonna say futuristic
Mhm,
steampunk like l- style. And you're like, well, this is not necessarily the truth of the world that Bella is in.
right.
Like if you took a photograph, it is her perception of the world or her interpretation of the world and the stimulus that is being brought to her in that
I like
world,
that.
right?
Mhm.
So it's a little bit more like, and then there's all of these sort of like fisheye camera things. There's almost like a
Yeah,
peephole,
it's very voyeuristic.
right?
There are certain moments where we literally are seeing through a fish-eyed peephole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's, you're sort of like, is this even though it sometimes like you are seeing Bella, it is like, is this her perception of the world? Is this her looking out into the world and kind of this is what she is seeing, so to
Mhm,
speak, of her world. But yeah, so like we move into this like super saturated phase, which you might think of as perhaps adolescence, or,
mhm. Yeah.
Um, and then like her phase like in the brothel is like very like raw. Like there's
Mhm.
like snow and it's dark and like you
And
can
she's
tell at
wearing
the
makeup,
places.
like obvious makeup for the first time, really. She's
Mhm.
worn like lip color, but like even though, yes, of course, it's a movie, she has makeup all the time, it's makeup applied to look natural and
Mhm.
unapplied, right? Like
Yeah,
not present. And then in the
yeah,
brothel, we see her first really fully done up in makeup, and it's garish,
yeah,
right? She has these like true blue barn doors, and they're very chunkily applied. Like you
yeah,
said, it's no longer a stark black and white or just all candy coated fantasy. It is the real world has started to, or some aspect of it has started to peek in and sort of degrade, or poison might be stronger,
yeah.
but
But
the
she kind of
negatives have
also
come in.
she talks to the madam about it as
Mm-hmm.
well, and the madam is like, "Oh, you gotta let it, like, totally break you down,"
Yeah.
right? Like,
And you never know, right? You never know if the
right?
madam is being honest with her or
Mm,
if she's using her, because there's some
she's
great
right.
lines.
Also trying to control her and keep
Mm-hmm.
her there because Bella is making her money, right? Bella's
Exactly.
got her whole system, like, she's very, like, uh, successful at what she's doing
Mm-hmm.
there, and she doesn't seem like she is necessarily having a terrible time being a prostitute, but she's having a terrible time coming of age in this
Yes.
world and learning the truths and starting to participate as a more adult character with opinions and trying to, taking action and being part of different communities, like
Mm-hmm.
where, like she, is a part of the community in the brothel, right? She's friends there. She has a superior there. She has clients there.
Hmm.
But then also they're going to political meetings and like they're knowing and meeting people in other communities outside of that, which you also do as a developing adult, right? Young
Hmm.
adult. So I was thinking like when I was saying adolescence, I was thinking more like, like elementary school, maybe middle
Right.
school age, and then she moves into like her teenage, young adult, like young 20s age. And then I feel when she is going back home to see her dying creator, she's kind of reached her like coming into herself
Hmm.
phase. So like maybe like post 25, like once your development, your brain
Hmm.
development is considered to be done and like you're solidifying, but like maybe you're not quite all the way there yet and knowing who you are. So this sort of like maybe 25 to 35 year old period where she's going back home.
She's capable of nuance
Right.
now, right? When she talks to the
Right.
scientist, it's not like I love you or I hate you. It's I I can accept what you did because it gave
Hmm.
me life, which I want.
I wanted
I
that.
hate, right. I hate you for the lies and the trapping.
Yeah.
And he, very much like her, is said, I, I, okay. He's like, I comprehend this. I understand this.
Right.
And it's just that whole, with him, it feels like uh, a forced facade, right? Not facade, the device of the scientific removal of oneself from the experiment. That's his
Mhm.
protection system, right? And so
Right.
he needs, and that conversation, because he's dying at that point. We know he has cancer, and that's what's brought her back home. And
Yeah.
you know, he says, I forget the exact wording, which is unfortunate because it's very good wording, but he's she says that to him, and he mentions his father. She says, you will be my surgeon, because she says, I know now, returning, smelling the formaldehyde, my happy places and the I will be a doctor. That's her,
Hmm.
like, I will be a doctor, which makes sense because she is, for her, since her sort of self-realization that she is a being not of ultimate power and there are others in the world that may be suffering while she is enjoying, right? She's
Yeah.
decided that she wants, her goal is to make the world a better place. Literally,
Yeah.
she says what she means, right? And so being a doctor then would make sense because she sees that as helping someone or a potential to help someone, right? It also,
Yeah.
it's a tool, it has a potential to not help someone like her father. um,
Right.
and so we see that, and she says that, and he says something along the lines, my father told me, it was something like cut with, not compassion, but something like that, cut with compassion, the implication being
Mm.
like, you never, you always have your emotion, your positive emotion, that desire to help in your surgery. Like that is
Yeah.
that needs to be in you. And then he says, my father, he was something like, he was an idiot, or he was a moron, but that, I
Yeah.
think, is good advice. And it's the first time we see his acknowledgement of that sort of delusion he holds so he could function, because he's only seemed to speak of reverence of his father, even though he
Yes,
did all
that's
these
true.
horrible things to him. I mean, truly made him unable to function as a normal human being.
Yeah.
Yet at that point, he acknowledges to her, he's like, well, he was an idiot. Like, which implies he knew nothing of what he did. All, implies so many things. And so we understand now that there is uh, a self-reflection that the father has, that he did not make others aware of. And it, in like the scientific viewpoint, that the sort of the reading of situations in a methodical way, that is also like her, right? She
Mhm.
is not without self-reflection.
Yeah.
um and so it's nice because I think they do a very good job of making clear without telling us that there is a familial connection between these two. And it's also not without its problems, right? Like, he lied and controlled, but he also gave birth, which is such a very, like, stark statement of what it is to have a parent, right? To you
Yep.
have a parent. They
Yeah.
have lied to you. They have done things that have essentially trapped you in a role or a location, and yet they also gave birth to you. Like, it's not without love, but there is the potential, and at some point, I think all of us will, whether we don't want to, but all of us will experience or have the realization of treating someone we love selfishly for what we want, and that's all implied in that, right? And so there's just so many pieces of this film that reflect back on our world, which is truly what I mean. The overused saying that, like, life imitates art, right? Like, the
Yeah.
which is the implication. It's not quite used right, in my opinion. The implication is that when art is created and it really has an effect in the world now sees it, and so it's operating differently than it was, right? The experiment
Mhm.
now has it's no longer controlled. There's been a new element entered, and that element fundamentally changes life because of itself. We use it, though, in a way that means, well, our art reflects our life, right?
Yeah.
Which is a much more accurate statement, more obvious statement, because of course it's being
Yeah.
created by those of us who live in life. But that's the case with this movie.
Yeah.
It
Yeah, no,
reflects
like, I
back on
feel
us
like
stuff.
this one just, like, really holds up a mirror,
Hmm.
like, right, to the audience, like, to the
Hmm.
viewer. Um, each person's gonna see something different as each person sees something different in, like, other works of art that they
Right.
might be viewing. They may hopefully like, I feel like this movie is really challenging
Yeah.
people to see aspects of themselves, see aspects of their communities or their experience growing up.
Hmm.
Um, through this lens of this super, like, odd, l scientific, like, sci-fi-esque kind of world, um, but the things that it's reflecting are very, like, valid of the
Hmm.
society that many of us in the Western world live in, especially with gender roles and, as you were pointing out, like, male attitudes towards women.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you've used the word which I think is just so accurate, and I couldn't pick it out in my brain until we talked. It is challenging, and that's its intent,
Mm.
right? And that is actually very open. The director who is this is the kind of movie he makes, right? It's Yorgos Lanthimos. He's a Greek director. He's worked with this is his fourth film with Emily Stone, and he's got a fifth one coming out, Begonia, which interestingly, if anyone it's planned to come out in 2025. Begonia. It's actually a remake of a very, very cool film by Junhuan Zhang, which in English they call Save the Green Planet, and it is a satirical comedy. It's these people uh, kidnap a CEO because they believe she's an alien who's bent on destroying the earth and the environment. It's a crazy interesting movie, and so it is being remade. I normally do not like remakes of contemporary films. I'd rather watch the original. However, I do not think, given Yorgos Lanthimos's uh, track record, that we will see something unoriginal. Save the Green Planet itself was original, and I think we will see this movie as something different than a direct translation, so to speak. But yes, in fact, as we record this, we're recording this on June 27th. Emily Stone and uh, my brain is blanking here, and Yorgos's next movie, Kinds of Kindness, actually airs tomorrow in select
Mhm.
theaters. So you can all check that out. It is bound to be a fascinating film. It has quite high critical reception so far. They also worked together on a short film called Bleat. That is not the original title. That is the translated title. I think the original is something like Vihili or something, or Vili. I certainly do not speak that language very well. So interesting. And then there's, of course, I think most horror fans, if you're interested in contemporary horror, will recognize Yorgos's name as a director of The Killing of a Sacred Deer from 2017, which is a very odd movie and very much in line with his avant-garde take on visual storytelling. So I recommend all of his films, whether you like them or not. I think, as you said, Mandy, they are challenging and
Mhm.
it's
And that's
that's
not for
worrying.
everyone.
Sure.
That's why I was like, "Oh, I'm glad I came alone," because it's like, it is not for everyone, and you
Right.
really have to opt in to the
Yes.
challenge.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's just uncomfortable, and maybe, like, that's where that IMDb, uh, review came from. It's just
Yeah.
like, "I
A
don't get
resistance
it."
to interpreting it.
Yeah, they're just, like, only looking at surface level, like, "This is just super weird, and this girl is, like, doing weird stuff, and, like, not a lot of it makes sense, and it's not even really that funny,
Yeah.
so, like, blah." But, like, yeah, like, they're not opting into the challenge, like, they're not going deeper.
Very, very accurate. And before it sounds like, I mean, as you said, I recommend this film fully if you're what I consider a film lover, you like to analyze and be challenged, then you are doing a disservice to yourself if you don't watch it. It is one of the most interesting films I've seen in a long time. And it has inspired me to return to film criticism beyond just the sort of most of the time. I think as a film critic, you write reviews of films, right? And that's certainly a big part of it. And that is, there's nothing wrong with that. It is heavily what we do on this podcast. But then there's the other part of being a film critic, which is you're actually speaking to the art of filmmaking and the products of it and how they their content and how it affects us, right? That's the I call it literary criticism because I think that's more frequently understood, but you apply it in the same way with perhaps a different set of tools or an expanded set of tools, probably a different set of tools rather than fully expanded. It's not more or less than writing, but you apply that to your criticism, right? It's more in line with art criticism than it is with reviews. And that's something
Yeah.
that this kind of movie just lends itself to. Uh, uh, Quickly, I think if there's any critique I have of the film, if we could look in and see exactly how to fix things that are maybe a little imperfect, the there were maybe one or two short scenes of somewhat explicit sexual content that it's not there's nothing wrong with it, but they didn't need to be there.
Yeah.
There's, for example, there's a scene. I think what happened is they filmed it and then they're like, we can't not use this. We went to all the trouble to film this
Mhm.
moment, which is like, yeah, it's explicit, but Mark Ruffalo putting Emily Stone's nipple in his mouth at one point. Like, nothing wrong with that. However, it was unnecessary in that moment, I felt, because I'm like, we already have like three different scenes of them engaging in different sex acts and positions, which gives us what we need for this, which is, she's completely uninhibited and because she has an adult body with this young mind, sex feels good. So in other words, it's like candy, right? It's just another form of pleasure. And for her. And so it has a purpose, but you could have trimmed some of that down. The bigger critique I had is they did not make clear enough for me, considering how well paced and delivered all the rest of the information and her progression was. Her change, her abrupt recognition of tragedy when she sees the slums on her journey. I can't remember if it's to Lisbon or what. It's right before they reach Paris. She sees it breaks her down. She wants to help them. She wants to find a way. And of course, the reality is that people are telling her is, well, you can't. And like, well, you might be able to in some larger imagining, but that moment you cannot fix their lives. It was powerful, but it seemed so abrupt because she has been so non-affected by the consequences of her actions up until that point that it was hard to see why empathy would all of a sudden shoot to the surface in her brain. I wish that there was just one or two more tiny inklings of the development of her empathy before it is completely cracked open by that horror. The scene of it's a scene of literally murdered people, including babies, at the bottom of a cliff in a slum because they've been robbed and murdered because people are so desperate. So I think that could have used just a little bit more nuance. The movie is already quite long. I think that's another thing that sets it apart from people if they're willing to go see this kind of movie, but they're really not into this kind of movie. It's not Avengers Endgame at 2.5 hours. It's a 2 hour, 21 minute art house film. So those are what I would change. Is there anything you would adjust or change or perhaps add to this movie?
Hmm. I didn't really think about that as like a rewrite or like even a request
Hmm.
for something to be different. I hadn't really thought of it that way. Like I just took it as it was, and I was
Hmm.
like, they made the choices that they did, and like I guess like the ending, I was maybe hoping like she was gonna figure out like a way to save her creator, but like
I
you
thought
can't
she was
save it.
going to put him in her terrible former husband's head. Um,
Yeah,
but I
but
almost
like
wish, yeah,
you can't it is natural to let go of your parents,
right.
and it's hard and painful to do, but I think that that's what they were saying with that. So like,
Yeah.
and I think like maybe they wanted you to like lead you in that direction and be like, yeah, if I could save my parents and give them like a
Hmm.
second opportunity at youth, or like a second opportunity as like a less damaged person, because we all have our own damages, right? And I think
Right.
one of the interesting things about becoming an adult, as you mentioned with Bella, is like you see your creators, you see your parents as human beings
Yeah.
with their
Right.
flaws and their challenges and their disappointments, like,
And you
and you
realize that when you
see
were a
that.
kid, they were kids, right?
Yeah,
Like you realize you're like, holy crap, like I am past the age when my parents became my parents. And I was
yeah,
like, you know so much. And then you realize, oh my God. Like I remember my mom said, like, you never feel like an adult. You don't, it's
uh-huh,
not how it works.
yeah,
And that was in many ways troubling. But it's true.
right.
And yeah, I
So anyway, ultimately, I like the choice that they made because it was kind of
same.
silly, and it wasn't like sugar coated. Like it was
Hmm.
like, oh, if they had her save her creator, like that would have not sat well either. Like if she'd
Right.
actually done that, um, it also would have introduced a very complicated dynamic.
Hmm. And they already have
um,
complicated like, and also
right?
it's interesting because it's
But
like because the film is so nuanced and has so many elements to explore, it's like even when something maybe wasn't intended, it's sort of
yeah,
irrelevant because it's it's how it is in the film, and so
yeah,
it's open to interpretation. And thinking about it too, I also thought, and I think you're right, I think they were leading us to assume she would save the scientist.
yeah,
However, like I think you're right, like you do let go of parents. It's a parallel and a parable, right? You let
yeah,
go of parents, and yet um then it's like, well, she says a lot of what she thinks generally, so why would that not be said? But then you're like, wait a
yeah,
minute, is the final stage realizing that you don't have to say everything, and
yeah,
you don't have to qualify everything for others, and you don't have to really be so explicit, and that would make
right,
sense, right? That almost sits better with me, but it's something that by the nature of it, by it's omission, right? By the
yeah,
nature of it being omission, they can't tell us that. They can only
mm,
show it. So it's hard to determine if it was intentional or not. I prefer to think it probably was because so much was intentional in this movie, and I like that idea. I
yeah.
hadn't really thought of that.
It would follow the progression as well, as like she has, the wisdom and comes into her own, and then
Yeah.
like the next is like she's in her 40s, and like you just get quieter and you sit back and like you just like pick so many fewer battles,
Hmm.
and let things kind of play out on their own. Like I don't know, like it seems like so many people just like stop trying. I don't want to say they stop trying to fix stuff, but they stop trying to fight so
Yeah.
many things that are just a natural process in life, right? You're just
Yeah.
like, it's more of like radical acceptance phase of your life.
Yeah, I think that's true. And in the best cases, we never fully acquiesce, right? We always have
Yeah.
that small pushback at least. But at the same time,
Mhm.
the world is designed in a certain way to people have designed it with more ability than us, right? Essentially, in our
Yeah.
world, it's more money, right? They have created a system in which
Yeah.
we are essentially a little too tired to fight back heavily. So,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
Gen
Anyway, and
Z,
then the
please pick it
last
up.
thing I would say, like in the garden, almost is like embracing the joy of the life that you want. and can create for yourself, right? Like,
And share it with others, right? Don't
yeah,
hold your capability to yourself. She, at the end, you realize she literally has brought other people into her fold because she cares about them, which
mhm,
is a small moment of, or a small symbol of her stated greater goal of making the world a better place, right? Well, I'm making it better for
yeah,
these people and also for myself. And I liked that. And I do want to mention just one more thing before we wrap up, because I think we've given our recommendations as to why and who will like this
yeah,
film. Is I mentioned it earlier, but I really like the the assistant,
mhm,
Max, is such a sort of, he's a non-confrontational person to the point of being weak in many ways, and not willing to fight for something, but of course still being a person and having his own desires and preferences. And at the end, she's walked away from his marriage to go explore what her previous life's husband uh had to show, and of course he was terrible, right? um and yet when we see the end, we do not necessarily see that she has married Max, but Max is still part of the, essentially the family, right? The RuPaul, like, we get to choose our family. It's kind of what's happened at the end, right?
yeah,
She He's happy and present, but I don't think he's in a relationship with her, a sexual relationship. She is with her friend from the brothel,
yeah,
the woman. And I think there's symbols of that. They are both sitting in a chair with drinks, and he is standing watching over, and not even watching over, he is standing watching, which sort of fits the bill of him being an assistant for the whole movie, right? It's not that he's on his way up, it's that that is his goal, is to be an assist without the risk and reward of being in charge. And there are
mhm,
those of us that's what we want, especially those of us who've had trauma that led to not being safe, right? The safety is enough. And I think that that's an interesting little moment in of itself, because he is a man who is less concerned or affected, or just possesses less of that machismo element of masculinity. And the result is he's happy, others are happy, but he is not what someone who is like a man's man would see as a success,
yeah,
which I think is fascinating. And I really like that reading of the end. And I think, because I think the assumption, if they hadn't done that, would have been that she went back and married Max.
yeah,
But in a way, it turned, they're almost more like brother and sister at that point, especially when the scientist is dying, the last scene with him, which again leads us to think that she's going to put his brain in Alfie's, the ex-husband, because um, they've just saved Alfie's life, and she's looking at the notes on brain transplant. And then the next scene is her sitting with, her dying de facto father. But we also see in the last like one or two shots of that scene, when she's laying with him, like with her head on his shoulder and he's laying back, it's revealed that Max is on the other side of him in the same position, um, like a child. And you're like, wait a minute, his being there is incredibly telling and intentional, but it's given to us in such a startling reveal, because it's so not it's not the plot focus of the movie, which is what I think is one of the strengths of this movie. There are elements everywhere that are not always clear until you watch it again. So I think this is, like, you've watched it a couple times, I think this is a movie to continue to return to, um,
yeah.
because you're always going to come away with some new element.
It definitely has like a rewatch, value.
Yeah, exactly, rewatchability. Well,
Rewatch.
so I babbled for an hour, and I've given Mandy 5 minutes. So thank you all so much for listening to this episode of Cult and Classic Films podcast. I know that we have had a lot of rebroadcasts lately, which, if you're listening to this months down the road or years down the road, which I hope you still are, then this is irrelevant to you, because it all seems like it just happened to you. But we will be continuing to have new content. And we do have changes coming to the pod, which I'm excited about. They are slow coming because they're complicated on our end, but As always, Cult and Classic Films, we're always changing, improving, bringing more stuff. Please go to cultandclassicfilms.com. Check out the movies that we have released in awesome Blu-rays and special edition Blu-rays with signed posters, all sorts of stuff. They're affordable, especially compared to other cult film releasing branches. And money goes directly to the filmmakers. If the filmmaker's not available, it goes directly to a charity. Okay, so we do our best to make the world a better place in our small way. So you can help us do that. You can also go to patreon.com/cultandclassicfilms and join to either just support us for a couple of bucks a month, get some special posts from us, or you can join for either $20 or $25 and actually get those films mailed directly to you every single month. So you get all of the releases at a discount. So thank you all so much for listening. To play us out is the Chud with All About Evil. Stay safe, stay weird, and tune in next week for another episode of Cult and Classic Films. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to Cult and Classic Podcast. This podcast is important to me, but what's more important are the rights, privileges, and freedom from violence of everyone in this country and in this world. And that means supporting Black Lives Matter. If you'd like to make a donation, please go ahead and visit cultandclassicpodcast.com, where we have a list of places you can donate and help out. And please stay safe.